The night stretched wide over the Texas plains, vast and endless, the kind of darkness that swallowed everything except for the silver moon hanging high above. The roar of engines cut through the stillness like a blade, shattering the quiet as the Black Vultures thundered down the deserted highway. Jax Crow Miller rode at the head of the pack, his black helmet reflecting the moonlight, his hands gripping the handlebars of his Harley like he was steering the devil's chariot. Behind him, his crew followed in formation. 18 men clad in leather and arrogance, a pack of wolves disguised as bikers. This was their life, the road, the power, the lawless thrill of taking what they wanted and leaving only dust and regret behind. Tonight was supposed to be easy, a ranch in the middle of nowhere, rumored to belong to some reclusive millionaire. An easy target. No neighbors, no cops, just a few walls standing between them and a big payday. But as they cut their engines and rolled into the gravel driveway, something felt wrong. Crow's instincts, the ones that had kept him alive through shootouts, backroom deals, and prison yards, screamed at him to stop, to turn back. But there was no turning back, not when they were this close. The ranch sprawled before them, a massive two-story estate surrounded by nothing but open land. White paint, wraparound porch, the kind of place built for quiet and solitude. No alarms, no security cameras, just a house standing alone under the moonlight. The perfect job, or so it seemed. The first sign of trouble. The Black Vultures dismounted, boots crunching against the gravel as they moved toward the front door. Crow motioned for Rhett, his second in command, a broad-shouldered brute with a scar running down his cheek, to take point. Rhett pulled a crowbar from his belt, but just as he reached for the door, a light flicked on upstairs. The bikers froze. No one was supposed to be here. The intel was solid. The place was supposed to be empty. Then a shadow moved behind the curtain on the second floor. "Shit," murmured Tommy Keys Carter, the gang's tech guy. "I thought you said this place was abandoned." "It is," Crow growled, eyes narrowing. "Stay sharp." Rhett didn't hesitate. He swung the crowbar and the door burst open with a splintering crack. The Black Vultures poured inside like a storm, guns drawn, adrenaline pumping. But instead of silence and emptiness, they found something they hadn't expected. The house was fully furnished, not abandoned, lived in. A fireplace smoldered in the living room, a half-eaten steak dinner sat on the dining table, still fresh. And then came the voice. Calm, unhurried, broadcasted through hidden speakers. "You just made the worst mistake of your lives." Every gun in the room snapped up at once. "Who the hell?" Rhett started, but the sentence never finished, because a gunshot rang out from the darkness, a single sharp crack. The bullet struck the wood beam just inches from Crow's head. Sniper. The bikers scattered, knocking over furniture as they dove for cover. "Where are they?" someone shouted. Another gunshot, another warning. Then the voice again. "Put your weapons down, walk away now. You don't know what you've just walked into." Crow's pulse thundered in his ears. No alarms, no cops. Just one man talking through a hidden speaker system, shooting at them from the shadows. Who the hell was this? The truth hits like a bullet. "Find the bastard," Crow ordered, pushing himself behind an overturned couch. Tommy pulled out his laptop, scrambling to jam the security system, but before he could even touch the keyboard, the power in the entire house died. Total darkness. Then a projector flickered on, casting a grainy image onto the far wall. The bikers turned, weapons ready, and froze when they saw it. A photograph. A framed portrait of a man in uniform. A face every man in the room recognized instantly. Because the house they had just broken into? It belonged to a former president of the United States. Silence gripped the room. "Jesus Christ," Rhett whispered. Crow stared at the image, his blood turning to ice. Because he knew that face. Everybody did. John Everett Lancaster, ex-president, ex-military, a war hero turned commander-in-chief. And they had just invaded his home. Suddenly this wasn't just a robbery. This was a national crisis waiting to explode. The voice crackled through the speakers one last time. "You boys just stepped into a war you're not ready for. Walk away now, while you still can." But Crow knew the truth. It was too late to walk away. And somewhere outside, hidden in the darkness, the sniper took aim again. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. The Black Vultures crouched behind furniture, their guns trembling in their hands, their minds racing. A former president, not some rich rancher, not an easy score. John Everett Lancaster, a man who had commanded entire armies. A man with enemies in every dark corner of the world. And now he was their enemy. Crow felt the weight of it sinking in. This wasn't just a bad job. This was the kind of mistake that got men erased, not just from criminal circles, but from existence. Outside, the night stretched wide and empty, but Crow knew someone was watching. Someone with a rifle, a sniper who had already chosen his next target. "Last chance!" The voice crackled through the speakers again. "Drop your weapons, leave the way you came, or don't. Either way, you're already dead men walking." And then the third gunshot rang out. This one wasn't a warning. This one hit home. The shot that changed everything. The bullet tore through the room, shattering a whiskey bottle inches from Rhett's face. Glass sprayed across the floor as he dove behind a chair, swearing. "We need to move!" Tommy shouted, his fingers fumbling to pull out a tablet, trying to hack into whatever the hell kind of security system this was. Another shot, then another. Each one precise, calculated. Whoever this shooter was, they weren't missing by accident. "This is your last warning." Crow had two choices. He could order his men to run, cut their losses, leave this job behind, or he could do what he did best, fight back. And Crow Miller had never been one to back down. Pushing back. He took a slow breath, forcing himself to think. The sniper was outside. That meant if they could get through the house, they had a chance. He signaled to Rhett and two others, Mace and Big Al. "Basement," he whispered. "Find a way out." Rhett nodded, motioning the others to follow. Tommy was still frantically working his laptop. "I can get into the security feed," he said, voice tense. "Might give us a look at where the bastard is." Crow nodded. "Do it. Everyone else, stay low, keep moving. We're getting the hell out of here." They moved quickly, navigating through the dark house like rats in a trap. And that's when everything changed again. The man in the room. As they slipped through a hallway, Crow felt it before he saw it, a shift in the air, a presence nearby. He turned, and there, standing in the shadows, was a man, not holding a gun, not running, just standing there, watching, and Crow recognized him instantly. John Everett Lancaster, the former president, the man whose house they had just invaded, and he wasn't afraid. He was smiling. "You boys have no idea who you just pissed off." The air in the room turned electric. Crow's gun snapped up immediately, but Lancaster didn't flinch. "If I were you," the ex-president said, his voice calm as steel, "I'd lower that weapon. That sniper outside, he doesn't miss twice." Crow hesitated, and in that split second, bang! A shot rang out, this time hitting Tommy's laptop, shattering the screen, killing any hope of hacking into the system. The sniper had taken the shot. Lancaster smiled again. "Told you, he doesn't miss twice." The realization. And then the real horror set in. Crow heard the distant crunch of tires on gravel. Not motorcycles, not police sirens, something worse. Military vehicles, heavy, armored, coming down the road. Lancaster stepped forward, just a little. "You want to know the real mistake you made tonight?" "Son," he asked, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. Crow didn't answer. "You thought this was just about money." The lights in the house suddenly flickered back on. The screens, the ones Tommy had tried hacking into, came to life. Security feeds appeared on every TV, every monitor, and Crow finally saw what was inside the ranch. Not just a house, not just a millionaire's retreat. This was a classified bunker, a place filled with government files, weapons, secrets, and now they were all on camera. "You boys are on a live feed to the United States government." Lancaster said, shaking his head. There's no walking away from this one. Crow's pulse roared in his ears. They had just walked into a war they couldn't win. And the real battle, it hadn't even started yet. The weight of it hit Crow like a sledgehammer. They hadn't just broken into the wrong house. They had declared war on a ghost. John Everett Lancaster, ex-president, ex-military, a man who had seen more battlefields than any of them could ever imagine. And they had just waltzed into his private war room like a bunch of drunken fools looking for easy cash. And now, the whole world was watching. The security screens lining the walls of the estate flickered with surveillance footage, each one showing a different angle of the house. Some showed the bikers, caught in infrared, weapons drawn. Others showed the approaching convoy of armored vehicles, headlights cutting through the darkness like a pack of wolves closing in for the kill. And then there was Lancaster himself, standing there like he had already won. The realization Crow's mind raced. They needed a way out. We can fix this, Rhett muttered behind him, voice strained. We get out of here now, disappear, act like this never happened. Disappear, Crow whispered back, his voice edged with disbelief. You think we can just disappear? He gestured at the screens. We're already ghosts, Rhett. And ghosts get erased. Lancaster took a slow step forward, hands clasped behind his back as if he wasn't standing in a room full of armed criminals. You look like a man who's trying to figure out how bad he just screwed up, he said, his voice low, steady, almost amused. Crow lifted his gun again, but this time it felt useless. Let me save you the trouble, Lancaster continued. You broke into a place you don't understand, and now there are men outside who would rather burn this house to the ground than let you leave with what's inside. Silence. Lancaster's ice-blue eyes locked onto Crow's. You boys really don't know who you just pissed off, do you? And then Tommy spoke, his voice shaky as he stared at one of the screens. Jesus Christ, he whispered. Crow, look at that. Crow turned and saw it. A wall of framed photographs, presidential moments, military ceremonies, official handshakes, and then one that made Crow's stomach drop. A picture of Lancaster standing beside a man every outlaw in America knew by name. A man whose reputation was built on quiet assassinations, black ops missions, and the kind of government work that didn't officially exist. A name that made even the most hardened criminals hesitate. Dane Harper, the former head of a classified government task force. A man who had spent 20 years hunting down threats to national security. And they had just broken into his best friend's house. Panic sets. Mace took a step back, his gun trembling in his grip. Shit, he muttered. Shit, shit, shit. We gotta go. Tommy was already closing his laptop, his face pale as a corpse. You don't just mess with guys like this, he hissed under his breath. This isn't some banker or oil tycoon. This is national security level stuff. And then, boom. A massive explosion shook the ground outside. Dust rained from the ceiling. The house shuddered from the force. Rhett stumbled backward. What the hell was that? Lancaster barely flinched. He glanced at his watch, then smirked. That, he said calmly, was your first warning. Crow's ears rang as he stumbled toward the window. Outside, the convoy had stopped. Floodlights blazed to life, cutting through the night, illuminating the entire house like a stage in hell. Black SUVs, armored trucks, tactical teams. And standing at the center of it all, a group of men in combat gear. Not cops, not feds, something worse. The watchdogs, the arrival of the watchdogs. Crow recognized the name instantly. A private paramilitary force, loyal only to John Everett Lancaster. Men trained to kill first and ask questions never. One of the men outside spoke into a radio. His voice carried through the speakers in the house. Mr. President, you okay in there? Lancaster turned to the camera in the corner of the room, smiled and responded, I'm fine, gentlemen. Just entertaining some guests. Crow's stomach twisted. This wasn't a standoff. This was a trap. They weren't just up against one former president, they were up against his army, and the watchdogs weren't interested in taking prisoners. Lancaster turned back to Crow, his smirk never fading. "You've got about 60 seconds before those men outside decide you're not worth keeping alive," he said, his voice almost casual. "You might want to start making decisions faster." Crow's choice. His mind spun. Options. He needed options. He could shoot Lancaster now, try to use him as a hostage. But the watchdogs wouldn't care. They would storm the house and wipe them all out before he could blink. He could surrender. But that wasn't an option either. Not when they had just stumbled onto something bigger than themselves. Then Rhett spoke up, his voice strained. "What if we make a deal?" Crow's head snapped toward him. "What?" Rhett swallowed hard. "We've got information," he said quickly. "Connections. We move guns, drugs, people. You're telling me there's nothing you need from us?" Lancaster raised an eyebrow. For the first time, he actually looked interested. Crow hesitated. He knew what Rhett was doing. He was buying time, but time wasn't going to save them. Outside, the watchdogs moved closer, their silhouettes cutting through the floodlights. Lancaster watched them, then turned back to Crow and smiled. "You want to make a deal?" he mused. "All right, boys. Let's talk." But Crow knew one thing for certain. They weren't negotiating their way out of this. They were negotiating their way into something worse, something that would get every last one of them killed. The weight of the situation pressed down like a boot on Crow's chest. The watchdogs were closing in, their silhouettes cutting through the blinding floodlights outside. Armored trucks, combat gear, military-grade rifles. This wasn't a simple break-in anymore. This was a war, and John Everett Lancaster, he wasn't the type of man to lose. Crow knew what Rhett was doing, trying to buy time, but he also knew the truth. They weren't walking away from this, not unless they gave Lancaster a reason to let them. "You want to make a deal?" Lancaster said, his smirk barely fading. "All right, boys, let's talk." Negotiation with a ghost. Crow forced himself to think. He didn't trust Lancaster. Hell, he didn't trust anyone. But trust wasn't the problem here. Survival was. "You want information?" Crow asked, keeping his voice level. "Fine, we can deal." Lancaster tilted his head, watching Crow like a predator sizing up prey. "You don't even know what I want," he said. "Doesn't matter," Crow shot back. "We have things you can use. Arms dealers, cartel connections, black market routes. We know people who can get things the government can't." Lancaster raised an eyebrow. "You think I don't already know all that?" "You might," Rhett interjected, stepping beside Crow. "But you don't have access. That's where we come in." A pause. Lancaster glanced at the security screens, the ones still showing the watchdogs advancing. He tapped a small device in his pocket. The radio on the lead watchdog's vest crackled to life. "Hold position. No one fires unless I say so." The men outside stopped moving. Just like that, Crow swallowed hard. Lancaster wasn't just an ex-president. He was still giving orders like he was in office. "All right," Lancaster said slowly, turning back to them. "Let's pretend, for a moment, that you're useful. What exactly do you think you can offer me that I don't already have?" The bait Crow chose his words carefully. He knew Lancaster wasn't the type of man to be bluffed, so he didn't bluff. "You've got enemies," Crow said. "A lot of them. People who would pay a fortune to know where you've been hiding all these years." Lancaster's expression didn't change. But Crow saw the flicker in his eyes. He had struck a nerve. "You don't want money," Crow continued. "You don't need power. But you do need to stay in the shadows. And the people we deal with, they know how to keep things hidden." Rhett nodded, catching on. "We've moved fugitives across borders. We've smuggled weapons past government checkpoints. We've got routes that don't exist on paper. If you want to stay buried, we can help." A tense silence settled over the room. Lancaster glanced at the security feeds again. Then, without warning, he laughed. A low, genuine chuckle. "You boys really think you're negotiating, don't you?" he said. Crow stiffened. Lancaster's eyes locked onto his. "You don't seem to understand the position you're in," he continued, stepping forward. "You're not at the table. You're on the table. Crow clenched his fists. "Then what the hell do you want from us?" Lancaster stopped walking and smiled. "I want you to understand the game you just walked into. The truth about the ranch." Lancaster motioned toward the security screens. The cameras flickered, shifting angles, until they showed a bunker beneath the house. Rows of file cabinets, weapons crates, computers running on encrypted networks. Crow's stomach dropped. This wasn't a ranch. This was a classified government facility. "You thought you were robbing some rich recluse," Lancaster said. "Instead, you broke into one of the most secure black sites in the country." He gestured toward the files. "This place doesn't exist on any map," he continued. "Not officially. But inside that bunker, there are enough secrets to burn Washington to the ground." Mace cursed under his breath. "Jesus Christ! That's what the watchdogs are protecting," Lancaster said. "And now that you've seen it, you don't get to just walk away." Silence. Crow felt the weight of the words pressing down on him. If this was a government black site, then that meant— His eyes snapped to Lancaster. "You were never in hiding," he realized. "You were waiting." Lancaster nodded. "Waiting for the right moment," he said. "Waiting for the right people to make the wrong move, like you." Crow's heart pounded. They were trapped. The decision. Lancaster folded his arms. "So here's what's going to happen," he said. "You have two choices." He held up a finger. "One, you die right here. That's the easy option. Quick, clean, no loose ends." A second finger. "Two, you work for me. You do what I say when I say it. No questions, no hesitation. And in return, you get to keep breathing." Crow's pulse roared in his ears. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a recruitment. "We're not government assets," Rhett growled. Lancaster smirked. "You are now." Crow stared at him. "And if we say no?" Lancaster turned toward the security screen, tapped the radio. "Execute them." The shot that changed everything. The gunfire erupted instantly, but it wasn't coming from the watchdogs. It was coming from inside the house. A bullet ripped through Mace's shoulder, spinning him to the ground. Another shot blasted through Tommy's knee, dropping him where he stood. Crow whipped around, eyes wide, and saw the old man standing in the doorway. A ranch hand. At least, that's what he had looked like before. Now, he was holding a suppressed pistol, and his hands didn't shake. Lancaster sighed. "Damn it, Henry, I told you to wait." The old man, Henry, smirked. "Didn't see a reason." Blood pooled on the floor as Tommy groaned in pain. Mace gritted his teeth, pressing his hand to the wound. Crow felt his own breath quicken. They weren't being arrested. They were being broken. Lancaster turned back to Crow. "So," he said, "shall we continue?" Crow looked at the men bleeding at his feet. The watchdogs outside, waiting for the order to kill them all. Lancaster, smiling, unshaken, in control. And he realized there was no way out. He slowly raised his hands. "We'll work for you," he said. "But this isn't over." Lancaster's smirk widened. "Oh, Crow," he said, voice dripping with amusement. "It hasn't even begun." The silence in the room was thick, punctuated only by the sound of Mace groaning on the floor, blood seeping between his fingers. Tommy clutched his knee, his breath coming in ragged gasps as pain swallowed him whole. Crow could feel the weight of Lancaster's gaze, the smirk still playing at the edge of the former president's lips. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a takeover, and they had already lost. "You made the right choice," Lancaster finally said, his voice calm, almost amused. "But let's be clear, this isn't a partnership. This is conscription." Crow clenched his jaw. "You think we're just gonna roll over?" Lancaster chuckled, stepping closer. "I don't need you to roll over," he said. "I need you to understand who's in control." He turned toward Henry, the old ranch hand-turned operative, who was still holding the suppressed pistol like he was born with it. "Patch them up," Lancaster ordered, nodding toward Mace and Tommy. "I need them alive, for now." Henry nodded, holstering his weapon. Crow's hands balled into fists. They weren't dying tonight, but they weren't free either. A noose, not a deal. Lancaster turned back to Crow, his blue eyes razor-sharp. "You're going to work for me," he said. "That's not a question. But I'm not stupid. You don't trust me, and I sure as hell don't trust you. So we need an understanding. He motioned toward the security screens, now showing live feeds of the watchdogs still waiting outside. You step out of line once, Lancaster said. They bury you where you stand. He then pointed to a different screen, one that sent a cold shiver through Crow's spine. The Black Vultures' clubhouse, their home, the place where the rest of the gang, the ones who weren't here tonight, were drinking, laughing, playing cards, completely unaware of the hell Crow had just walked into. Lancaster's smirk faded. You tried to run, tried to backstab me, tried to play any of those outlaw games? His voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. I won't just come for you. I'll burn your entire crew to the ground. Crow's stomach twisted. They weren't just trapped. They were leashed, and Lancaster held the chain. Forced loyalty. Rhett's breathing was shallow beside him. Fine, he said, his voice raw with anger. What the hell do you want us to do? Lancaster finally stepped back. There's a storm coming, he said, and I need soldiers, not government boys, not mercenaries. His eyes locked onto Crow's. I need people who know how to break the rules. Crow narrowed his eyes. You're sitting on a bunker full of Black Ops intelligence. You've got an army outside. Why the hell do you need us? Lancaster's smirk returned. Because you're expendable, he said simply. Rhett bristled, but Crow already knew the truth. If Lancaster was using them, it meant he needed something off the books, something that even the watchdogs couldn't be tied to. How do we know you won't kill us when we're done? Crow asked, his voice carefully measured. Lancaster's smirk didn't fade. You don't. The first mission, Lancaster stepped over to a metal cabinet in the corner of the room. He punched in a code, and the heavy steel doors hissed open. Inside, a single manila folder. He tossed it onto the table between them. Crow hesitated. Then slowly he reached out and flipped it open. Inside was a grainy surveillance photo of a man none of them recognized. Who the hell is this? Crow asked. Lancaster leaned forward. His name is Raymond Beckett, former intelligence operative, ex-CIA, ex-NSA. Now, he's selling classified information to the highest bidder. Crow's eyes flicked back to the image. Beckett was old, maybe late 50s, with a permanent scowl and eyes that had seen too much. So what? Rhett asked. You want us to kill him? Lancaster shook his head. Not yet. You're going to kidnap him. Crow's jaw tightened. This is a mistake, he said. You're asking us to go to war with a man who used to work for the same government that trained your watchdogs. If he's dangerous enough to have you worried, then we don't stand a chance. Lancaster's eyes gleamed. That's the fun part, he said. You're not just taking Beckett, you're taking him from the Russians. A suicide mission. The weight of the words hung in the air. Crow's mouth went dry. The Russians? Tommy rasped from the floor, his breath still heavy from the gunshot wound. Lancaster nodded. Beckett went dark 6 months ago, he explained. Intel suggests he's working with a private Russian security firm. They're keeping him under wraps in a safe house outside of Houston. He paused. And now? I need him in my hands, alive. Crow exhaled through his nose. This is a suicide mission. Probably, Lancaster admitted. But the alternative is worse. He motioned toward the clubhouse camera again. Would you rather take your chances against the Russians? He asked. Or would you rather I send the watchdogs to burn your brothers alive? Crow saw red. But he also knew he was out of options. He didn't care about Lancaster's secrets. He didn't care about why Beckett was so important. All he cared about was keeping his crew alive. And right now, that meant playing Lancaster's game. He turned toward Rhett, then Tommy, then Mace. His men, beaten, bleeding, but still standing. Then he looked Lancaster in the eye. We'll get your guy, he said. But when this is over, we're coming for you. Lancaster's grin widened. Oh, Crow, he said. You still don't get it, do you? He leaned in closer. This will never be over. The weight of the deal sat heavy in Crow's chest as he watched Lancaster smirk, his blue eyes filled with amusement that only a man who had already won could wear. They weren't partners in this. They weren't even allies. They were chess pieces, and the first move, taking Raymond Beckett from the Russians. Crow didn't know much about Beckett, but he knew one thing. If a former US president was sending out-of-luck bikers to take him, it meant Beckett was dangerous as hell. And now the Black Vultures were standing on the edge of a cliff, a plan that would get them killed. Lancaster tapped a small device in his pocket, his voice calm as ever. "Watchdogs, stand down. The situation is under control." Crow watched the security screens as the armed men outside backed away, melting into the darkness like ghosts. That was the power Lancaster wielded. He didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to make threats. One sentence, and a private army obeyed. "You have 48 hours, Lancaster said, returning his gaze to Crow. "Beckett's extraction happens in 2 days. Fail, and your crew burns." Crow felt his pulse roar in his ears. He was used to power plays, used to dealing with gang wars, cartel shipments, backroom deals gone bad. But this was different. This was something bigger than them, bigger than they were ready for. Still, he forced himself to keep his face neutral. "You better hope we succeed," Crow muttered. "Because if we go down, we're taking this whole goddamn house with us." Lancaster's smirk never wavered. "That's the spirit. The escape from the ranch." Henry, the old man who had shot Mace and Tommy like he was swatting flies, gestured toward the back entrance. "Your bikes are out back," he said. "We put 'em back together after my boys tore 'em apart. Should run fine." Crow hesitated. It was too easy. They'd walked into hell, and now they were just being let go. Something about it made his skin crawl, but he wasn't about to stick around and ask questions. He turned to Rhett. "Get Mace and Tommy moving. We leave now." Rhett nodded. The bikers moved fast, helping their wounded out the door. Outside, their Harleys sat waiting under the moonlight, polished, untouched. It was almost insulting, as if Lancaster knew they weren't going anywhere, as if they belonged to him now. Crow swung a leg over his bike, gripping the handlebars tight. A few seconds later, the Black Vultures were tearing down the Texas highway, the wind whipping against them, and for the first time in his life. Crow wasn't sure if he was riding toward freedom or straight into a grave. A mission with no way out. Back at the clubhouse, the rest of the Black Vultures were still drinking, still laughing, still living like they weren't standing on a minefield. Crow killed his engine, the others pulling in behind him. The second he stepped inside, the room went silent. Every man felt the shift in the air. They could see it on his face. Something had changed. "What happened?" Cole, one of his oldest riders, asked. Crow ran a hand down his face, exhaling slowly. "We're in deep," he said, "and we don't have a choice." He slammed the manila folder Lancaster had given him onto the table. "Meet Raymond Beckett," Crow said bitterly. "The guy we're stealing from the Russians." A long silence stretched across the room. "Then the Russians," Cole muttered, looking at the grainy photo. Crow watched the fear settle over the men. Even hardened outlaws knew better than to screw with the Russians, the Bratva, the ex-KGB types who ran security companies like their own personal armies. And now they were about to take one of their assets right out of their hands. "This is bullshit," Rhett growled. "We need a way out." Crow sat down heavily. "There isn't one," he said. "We pull this off, or we die. Simple as that." The setup. Over the next 24 hours, the Vultures planned like they never had before. They weren't just running guns or setting up ambushes. They were up against professionals, and that meant they had to play smarter. They scouted the Russian safe house, a fortified warehouse outside Houston. Surveillance showed guards posted on every entrance, multiple ex-military types, all carrying hardware that could rip through the Vultures in seconds. The mission: infiltrate, grab Beckett, get the hell out. Easier said than done. "How the hell do we even get close?" Mace asked, still bandaged up from his gunshot wound. Crow studied the blueprints. "Beckett gets moved at night," he said. "They transfer him from one safe house to another every few days." He pointed to a stretch of road near the edge of the city. "Here, this is where we hit him." The plan was risky, insane, but it was the only shot they had. The ambush. The next night, the Vultures waited in silence. The stretch of road was dark, empty, surrounded by fields that stretched for miles. Crow sat on his bike, gripping the handlebars tight. Then, headlights in the distance, a convoy of black SUVs moving fast. Rhett's voice crackled through Crow's earpiece. "They're coming." Crow nodded. "Wait for my signal." The SUVs sped toward them. Then the lead vehicle hit the spike strip. Tires exploded. The SUV swerved hard, crashing into a ditch. The convoy skidded to a stop. Then gunfire erupted. The Vultures struck fast, hard, taking out the first few guards before they could react. Crow sprinted toward the back SUV, ripping the door open. And there he was, Raymond Beckett, the man they were about to risk everything for. But something was wrong. Beckett looked up at Crow, his expression oddly calm. Then he smiled. "You boys are in way over your heads," Beckett murmured. Crow's pulse spiked. This wasn't a rescue, this was a setup. And before he could react, a gunshot rang out. One of his men, Viper, collapsed to the ground, a bullet clean through his chest. Then another shot, and another. Snipers, everywhere. The whole convoy had been a goddamn trap. The Black Vultures had just walked into their own funeral. The ambush erupted like a thunderstorm in hell. Gunfire ripped through the night, cutting through the warm Texas air like it was made of paper. The Black Vultures, once the predators of the road, were now the ones hunted. Crow's mind raced, every instinct screaming at him. They had been set up. This wasn't just a high-risk job, this was an execution. Raymond Beckett, the supposed target, wasn't just a prisoner. He was the bait, and they had taken it. A trap they never saw coming. "Move!" Crow bellowed, diving for cover as another round of bullets shattered the side mirror of the SUV. Rhett grabbed Tommy, who was already bleeding from the shoulder, yanking him behind the wreckage. "Where the hell are they shooting from?" Mace roared, clutching his gun. Crow scanned the area. Shadows, too many of them. Then he saw it. Movement on the ridge. "Snipers!" he shouted. "Up high!" Southwest side. But that wasn't all. Another convoy of black SUVs was closing in fast, kicking up dirt in the distance. "Jesus Christ," Rhett spat, peering through his rifle scope. "They've got backup incoming." Crow clenched his teeth. If they didn't move now, they were dead men. Beckett smiled through it all. Raymond Beckett sat inside the wrecked SUV, completely calm. Crow turned to him, his heart pounding. "You knew!" Crow snarled. Beckett tilted his head slightly. "What gave it away?" Crow grabbed him by the collar, yanking him forward. "You set us up." Beckett didn't flinch. "If I wanted you dead," he said evenly, "you'd already be in a ditch somewhere, bleeding out." That made Crow hesitate. "You don't understand the game you're playing," Beckett continued. "You think Lancaster sent you after me? No. He sent you into the fire to see if you'd survive it." Crow's grip tightened. "Why?" Beckett's smirk widened. "Because I know things that could burn this whole country to the ground. The decision, fight or run." The SUVs were getting closer, the sound of their engines roaring over the gunfire. Rhett's voice snapped through the chaos. "Crow, we gotta go." But Crow didn't move. Not yet. He looked at Beckett. He looked at the SUVs closing in. Then he made his decision. "We take him with us." Mace's head snapped toward him. "Are you out of your damn mind?" "If Lancaster wants him alive, we use him," Crow growled. "He's our only leverage." Beckett's smile didn't fade, but this time there was something different behind it, something dangerous. "Then let's go," Beckett said, "before your friends out there turn you into mulch." The escape. The Black Vultures moved fast, throwing open the doors of their remaining bikes and piling in as gunfire cracked through the air. Crow shoved Beckett onto the back of his Harley before gunning the engine. "Go, go, go!" The Vultures tore off into the night, gravel kicking up behind them. Behind them, the first SUV exploded. A well-placed shot from Rhett's rifle hitting the gas tank. But the others kept coming, the chase through the dark. They raced down the highway at breakneck speed, the roar of their bikes barely louder than the bullets still chasing them. The SUVs weren't backing off. Whoever these men were, they wanted Beckett dead. Crow's grip tightened on the handlebars as he swerved to avoid a hail of bullets. He glanced back at Beckett. The bastard was smiling. "You enjoying this?" Crow snapped. "Not really," Beckett mused. "But it's been a while since someone tried to kill me. Kinda miss the feeling." "Yeah," Crow growled. Well, stick with us and you'll get plenty more of it. Ahead, the road split, one path leading toward a canyon pass, the other back toward the city. Which way? Rhett barked. Crow's mind worked fast. If they went into the city, they'd have more cover, but they'd also be trapped. If they went into the canyon, they could lose the SUVs or get buried there. Crow made his choice. Canyon! The bikes veered right, just as another gunshot split the night. The last thing Crow saw before hitting the pass, the headlights of a helicopter cutting through the darkness above them. More players in the game. Son of a bitch, Rhett muttered. They've got air support. Crow gritted his teeth. This wasn't just the Russians anymore. This was bigger, much bigger. Beckett leaned in slightly, his voice barely audible over the wind. You're starting to realize, aren't you? Crow didn't answer, but he already knew. They weren't just running from a botched job. They had just stepped into a war. The night air ripped past Crow's face as his Harley roared through the canyon pass. Beckett still pressed against his back, his hands gripping the seat like he was enjoying the ride. But this wasn't a joyride. This was survival. Behind them, the Russians were still coming. The SUVs had been forced to slow down on the narrow canyon roads, but the helicopter wasn't stopping. Its searchlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across the jagged rock formations, hunting for them like wolves in the night. Crow gritted his teeth, gripping the handlebars tighter. They had minutes, maybe seconds, before this became a massacre. Nowhere to run. We can't outrun a helicopter, Crow, Rhett shouted over the roar of his engine. I know that, Crow bellowed back. But he had no other plan. Beckett, still clinging to him, leaned in just enough to be heard. You boys ever taken down a chopper before? Crow's knuckles went white. This ain't the time for jokes, old man. Beckett's smile was infuriatingly calm. It's not a joke, he said. I'm asking because if you haven't, well, we're gonna have to learn real fast. Crow shot a glance toward the rest of his men. Mace and Tommy were still alive, barely. Rhett was bleeding from somewhere. But still in the fight, Cole and Viper had taken the rear, keeping their guns trained on the SUVs still barreling through the canyon. They had one shot at this, and no backup, making a choice. There's a drop-off ahead, Mace shouted. Crow squinted through the dust cloud kicked up by their tires. Ahead, the road ended at a steep cliffside, dropping nearly 50 feet into a dried-out riverbed. A dead end, but also an opportunity. Crow made his call. Everyone, split up, he barked. We use the cliff. The gang veered in different directions, their bikes splitting into two groups as they neared the edge. The helicopter's searchlight wobbled for just a second, trying to track them, and that second was all Crow needed. The jump Crow gunned the throttle, Beckett laughing in his ear as they shot forward, and then they hit the drop-off. The bikes soared through the air, gravity yanking them down as they crashed into the riverbed below. The suspension screamed in protest, but Crow managed to hold the handlebars steady as the wheels hit dirt, fishtailing wildly. Behind him, Rhett and Mace followed suit, landing hard but still upright. Tommy! Tommy wasn't as lucky. His bike hit the ground wrong, flipping sideways, sending him slamming into the dirt. Crow skidded to a stop, his heart pounding. Tommy! But Tommy wasn't moving. Pinned down before Crow could reach him, the helicopter swept back over the canyon, its side door sliding open. A man with a rifle leaned out, his scope glinting under the floodlights. Crow dove off his bike, shoving Beckett down as the first bullet tore into the dirt beside them. Rhett cursed, dragging Tommy toward cover as Mace and Cole opened fire at the chopper. The bullets pinged off the underbelly, useless against the armored fuselage. We need to take that thing down, Rhett barked. No shit, Crow shot back. Beckett, somehow still grinning, tapped Crow's shoulder. You boys carry any explosives? Crow gave him a look. You think we ride around with C4 in our saddlebags? Beckett shrugged. Could have been fun. More bullets rained down, forcing them deeper into the riverbed. Crow's mind was spinning. They were outgunned, outmaneuvered, and out of time. Then his eyes landed on the canyon wall. Turning the tables, he grabbed Rhett's shoulder. How many rounds you got left? Not enough. Rhett admitted. Forget the chopper, Crow said. Shoot the cliff. Rhett blinked. Then his eyes widened. Shit, that could work. The walls of the canyon were loose, crumbling rock. A few well-placed bullets, and they could trigger a landslide. Rhett and Mace lined up their shots, aiming at the weakest points in the rock face. "On my mark!" Crow yelled. The helicopter banked for another pass, its gunner lining up a final shot. "Now!" Gunfire erupted. The canyon wall shuddered. For a second, nothing happened. Then the rocks gave way. A wave of boulders and debris came crashing down, slamming into the Russian convoy below. The first SUV was flattened instantly. The second tried to reverse, but the landslide swallowed it whole. The helicopter pilot saw it too late, yanking back on the controls to avoid getting caught in the falling rocks. The chopper tilted too hard and spun out of control. It slammed into the canyon wall. Metal shrieked and then boom! The explosion lit up the night, sending a shockwave through the valley. For the first time, the gunfire stopped. The only sound left was the crackling of flames. Aftermath. Crow dragged himself upright, his chest heaving. The vultures were still alive. Battered, bleeding, but alive. Tommy groaned beside him, still half-conscious. Mace wiped blood from his face, looking at the wreckage below. "Jesus," he muttered. "Did we just kill the Russians?" Crow shook his head. "No." He looked at the wreckage. "We just pissed them off." Beckett chuckled, completely unfazed by the chaos. "You boys are starting to impress me." Crow shot him a glare. "You knew this was a setup," he said. "You knew the Russians were waiting for us." Beckett didn't deny it. "Would you have believed me if I told you?" Crow's fists clenched. Rhett wiped his face, stepping closer. "We should kill him right now." Beckett's smirk didn't fade. "You could," he admitted. "But then you'd never find out why Lancaster really sent you after me." Crow froze. That was the question, wasn't it? Why did Lancaster send them to extract a man who clearly had no intention of being rescued? Beckett took a step forward, lowering his voice. "You still don't get it, do you?" he said. "This isn't about me." He gestured to the burning convoy below. "This is about whatever I stole from them." Crow's heart pounded. "Stole what?" Beckett's grin widened. "Something that's about to make your life a whole lot more complicated." The sound of approaching engines echoed through the canyon. The deep growl of armored vehicles cutting through the darkness like a death sentence. The Russians were coming. Crow could feel it in his bones. This was it. They had seconds to decide. Either they stood together or the Black Vultures died right here in a nameless canyon, buried under Russian bullets. But first, they had a bigger problem. Guns turned inward. Mace's hand didn't shake as he kept the gun pointed at Beckett's head. "We turn him over," Mace growled. "And we live." Crow stepped forward, slowly, his hands out. "You don't know that," he said, his voice low, even. Mace's jaw tightened. "I know they want him dead," he snapped. "And if we stand in their way, they'll kill us too." Rhett's gun was still on Mace. "You hand him over," Rhett said, voice cold. "And Lancaster, make sure we don't live long enough to regret it." Mace let out a harsh laugh. "You think we got a future after this?" He turned his gun slightly, pointing it at Crow now. "You think Lancaster lets us just walk away when this is over? We're pawns, man. You know it." Crow didn't deny it, because Mace was right. Lancaster wasn't saving them. He was using them. And the second they weren't useful, they were gone. Crow inhaled slowly. "You pull that trigger," he said, "and you make a choice for all of us." Mace's nostrils flared. "You really want to die for him?" Mace demanded, nodding toward Beckett. Crow's eyes never left him. "I'm not dying for him," Crow said. "I'm dying on my own terms, and I sure as hell ain't dying in the dirt while two-bit mercs decide my fate." Mace's grip tightened, and for a second, a long, tense second, it looked like he would pull the trigger. Then boom! A missile screamed overhead. The mountainside exploded, sending a shockwave ripping through the canyon. The Black Vultures were thrown off their feet, dirt and debris raining down as the Russians made their move. Mace hit the ground hard, his gun skidding across the stone floor. Crow was on him in an instant, pinning him down before he could grab it again. "You done?" Crow hissed. Mace didn't answer, his breathing ragged. Rhett grabbed the gun off the ground and shoved it into his waistband. "Good," Crow muttered. Then let's get the hell out of here before we all get turned into paste. The Russian assault. The Russians moved fast, their vehicles ripping into the canyon, headlights spearing through the dust. Gunfire erupted, cutting through the darkness like knives. The Black Vultures scrambled, diving for cover as bullets rained down. "We need an exit," Rhett bellowed, ducking behind a rock as a bullet ripped through the sleeve of his jacket. Crow's mind raced. The canyon was a trap. The only way out was through. He turned to Beckett, who had somehow stayed perfectly calm through all of this. "You got a plan?" Crow demanded. Beckett smiled. "Of course," he said. Crow gritted his teeth. "Well, spit it out, asshole." Beckett shrugged. "Drive fast, shoot straight, and don't die." Crow almost punched him. Instead, he turned to his crew. "Back to the bikes, now!" The Vultures bolted, bullets whizzing past them as they sprinted for their motorcycles. Rhett threw himself onto his Harley, revving the engine with a snarl. "We're not making it out if we don't take some of these bastards down." Crow gritted his teeth. They needed a distraction, something to slow the Russians down. Then an idea hit. Crow's gaze snapped to Beckett. "You know how to use explosives?" Beckett grinned. "Better than you." Crow tossed him a grenade belt. "Then earn your goddamn keep." Beckett caught it midair. "Now we're talking." Turning the tables, the Black Vultures roared to life, their bikes screaming down the canyon. Beckett, still handcuffed, somehow managed to pull a pin with his teeth and lobbed a grenade over his shoulder. Boom! The first Russian SUV flipped, slamming into the canyon wall. Crow grinned. "Not bad for a dead man, not bad for a biker who doesn't know when to quit." Beckett shot back. Rhett took a shot at the helicopter, his rifle kicking back against his shoulder. The bullet pinged off the armor, but the pilot swerved, momentarily disoriented. It was enough. "Faster!" Crow yelled. The canyon began to widen, the road curving into open desert. They were almost clear. Then a roadblock. The final obstacle, a massive convoy of Russian armored trucks, blocked the only exit. They weren't getting past that. Crow's stomach dropped. They were out of time. Then Beckett chuckled. "I'd hold on tight," he said. Crow whipped his head around and saw Beckett holding a detonator. "Wait!" Boom! The canyon wall exploded, rock and debris raining down onto the roadblock. Crow's bike nearly flipped as the shockwave hit, but the Russians weren't so lucky. The armored trucks were crushed, swallowed by tons of falling rock. Crow stared at Beckett, stunned. "You—" Beckett just winked. "I told you I was better at explosives." Freedom, for now. The Black Vultures shot through the wreckage, roaring onto the open desert road. Behind them, the Russians were buried for now. Crow exhaled, his hands shaking on the handlebars. He turned to Beckett. "You're going to tell me exactly what the hell is going on," Crow growled. Beckett smirked. "Oh," he said, "you're not going to like it." Crow clenched his teeth. He already knew that. But he also knew something else. This wasn't over, not even close. The Black Vultures thundered down the open desert highway, dust whipping behind them, their engines roaring beneath the moonlight. Behind them, smoke still curled from the canyon, the wreckage of Russian armored trucks buried beneath tons of collapsed rock. For now they were clear, but Crow knew it wouldn't last. The Russians weren't just going to give up, and neither was Lancaster. And at the center of it all, Raymond Beckett, the man who had just proven he was a hell of a lot more dangerous than they thought. A ticking time bomb. Crow kept his eyes forward, his grip tight on the handlebars. Beckett rode behind him, his hands still cuffed, but his posture was relaxed, like a man who wasn't worried at all. And that pissed Crow off more than anything. They had nearly died back there. And Beckett? He looked like he had just taken a Sunday drive. Crow finally cut the throttle, slowing his bike as they approached a burned-out gas station at the edge of the desert. The others pulled in behind him, their brakes screeching as they came to a stop. Nobody spoke. They just sat there, breathing heavy, adrenaline still coursing through their veins. Then Crow swung off his bike, grabbed Beckett by the collar, and slammed him into the side of the building. "Talk!" Crow growled. Beckett grinned. "Is this the part where you rough me up?" Crow's fist clenched, but he didn't throw the punch. "Enough games," he snapped. "We just went to war for you, and I still don't know why." What the hell is so important about you that the Russians and Lancaster both want you dead? Beckett studied him, his eyes sharp. Then he sighed. All right, he said. I'll tell you. A secret worth killing. For Beckett glanced around, making sure no one else was close enough to hear. Then he leaned in, lowering his voice. You ever heard of Project Revenant? Crow froze. Behind him, Rhett shifted uneasily. Revenant? Rhett muttered. What the hell is that? Beckett chuckled. Exactly, he said. Nobody's supposed to know, but let me tell you what it is. His smile faded. It's the kind of thing people kill for. Crow's stomach tightened. I'm listening. Beckett exhaled. Revenant was an off-the-books operation, he said. A global initiative, funded by multiple governments, intelligence agencies, and military contractors. A network built for one purpose. Controlling the chaos. Crow's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Beckett's lips curled. Blackmail, destabilization, coup coordination, political assassinations, false flag operations. You name it, Revenant had its hands in it. Crow felt a chill creep up his spine. This wasn't just black ops. This was bigger. And if Beckett had been part of it, he wasn't just some rogue operative. He was a walking time bomb of secrets. You're telling me Revenant was, what, a global conspiracy? Crow scoffed. Beckett smirked. Oh, don't be dramatic. It wasn't a conspiracy. It was business. Crow's jaw tightened. You're saying Lancaster was involved? Beckett laughed. Involved? Kid, he ran the damn thing. The truth about Lancaster. Crow took a step back. His mind racing. Lancaster, the former president. The man who had sent them on this mission, the man threatening to kill them if they failed. He had been running a global black ops syndicate. You're lying, Crow said. Beckett tilted his head. Am I? Rhett stepped forward, arms crossed. Why the hell would the Russians care? He demanded. Beckett let out a slow breath. Because Revenant didn't just stop when Lancaster left office. Crow and Rhett exchanged a look. Beckett continued. When Lancaster lost his second term, people thought he retired. But the truth? He chuckled. He just went deeper underground. Revenant wasn't about keeping America safe. It was about keeping Lancaster powerful. Crow's throat felt dry. Okay, he muttered. Say I believe you. That still doesn't explain why the Russians are willing to go to war over you. Beckett's grin returned. Because I stole something, he said. Then he pulled something from his jacket pocket, a flash drive. Crow's eyes widened. You son of a bitch, he muttered. Beckett twirled the flash drive between his fingers. On this drive, he mused, the entire blueprint of Revenant's active operations, every name, every mission, every dirty deal they ever made. Crow exhaled sharply. So you've got proof, he said. Beckett nodded. And now everyone wants me dead for it. The breaking point Mace stepped forward. Then why not just destroy it? Beckett shook his head. Because then I'm just another dead guy in a ditch, he said. This drive is the only thing keeping me alive. It's my insurance policy. Crow clenched his teeth. So what's your endgame? Beckett sighed. I don't have one, he admitted. I was hoping to disappear, but since you boys so kindly pulled me out of the fire, I figure we have a mutual interest in not getting buried. Crow's mind whirled. This was bigger than anything he had ever imagined, bigger than the Russians, bigger than Lancaster. If this drive got out, it wouldn't just cripple Revenant, it would burn the world down. The house finally splits. Mace shook his head. That's it, he muttered. I'm done. He stepped back, shaking with rage. This ain't our fight, he snapped. This ain't the kind of war we survive. Crow watched him carefully. Then Mace drew his gun. I'm out, he said, and I'm taking the drive with me. Crow's heart stopped. Rhett moved first, his gun snapping up. You really want to do this? Rhett asked coldly. Mace glared. We're dead men walking if we keep him alive, he spat. You know it, I know it. The only way we get out of this is by giving Lancaster what he wants. A long silence stretched between them. Then Crow made his choice. He stepped between them, facing Mace head-on. No, he said, we do this my way. Mace's jaw clenched. You sure about that? Crow nodded. Yeah, he said. I am. A pause. Then Mace lowered the gun, but Crow knew this wasn't over. The Black Vultures had just split down the middle, and soon someone was going to pull the trigger for real. The air inside the burned-out gas station was suffocating, thick with sweat, dust, and the raw scent of gasoline. The Black Vultures weren't just tired, they weren't just angry, they were coming apart at the seams. Mace stood with his gun lowered, but his hands were still tense, his knuckles white against the grip. Crow knew that look, the same look men get before they make a choice they can't take back. And Mace? He was a single heartbeat away from pulling the trigger. A brother no more. "You're making a mistake," Mace muttered. Crow shook his head. "No," he said. "I'm making a decision." Mace's eyes flicked to Beckett, who was still sitting far too comfortably against the wall, hands cuffed, yet acting like he was the only one in control. "This bastard ain't worth it," Mace spat. "You know it, Crow. You just don't want to admit it." Crow inhaled sharply. "You think handing him over saves us?" he asked. Mace didn't blink. "I think handing him over gives us a chance." Crow's pulse thundered in his ears. "A chance at what?" he pressed. "Living long enough for Lancaster to use us for something worse? Running until the Russians get tired and put a bullet in our skulls? You think there's a way out of this, Mace?" "There ain't." Mace's expression hardened. "There is, if we choose the right side." Crow's jaw tightened. "And which side is that?" Mace exhaled slowly. Then he made his choice. He holstered his gun. "Not yours," he muttered. And just like that, he walked away. A house divided. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They just watched as Mace disappeared into the dark, his boots crunching against the sand. The sound of his bike starting was like a funeral bell. Then he was gone. Rhett shook his head. "Shit," he muttered. Crow exhaled. "He'll go to Lancaster," he said. "Try to cut a deal. Try to save his own ass." Tommy, still nursing his wounded shoulder, grimaced. "You think Lancaster will take him back?" Crow looked toward the horizon, where Mace's taillight had already vanished into the distance. "No," he muttered. "I think Lancaster will use him." Setting the bait, Beckett stretched his arms, the metal cuffs clinking against each other. "Well," he said, "I guess that means you're finally picking a side." Crow shot him a glare. "We ain't on your side," he growled. Beckett smirked. "Sure you are," he said. "You just don't know it yet." Rhett shook his head, frustration clear on his face. "So what now?" he asked. Crow exhaled slowly. "Now," he said, "we set a trap." Drawing Lancaster in. They had 48 hours, maybe less, before Lancaster realized the job wasn't going his way. That meant they had one shot to flip the game, one shot to get the upper hand. They moved fast, setting up at an abandoned freight yard, a dead zone outside of town where nobody came looking for trouble because trouble already lived there. Crow parked his bike in the middle of the lot and waited. Waited for Mace to sell them out, waited for Lancaster to take the bait, waited for the hammer to drop, and sure enough, it did. The watchdogs close. In the first sign was the distant rumble of engines. Then the floodlights. Armored SUVs rolled in from all sides, headlights glaring like the eyes of a predator locking onto its kill. Crow didn't move, neither did Rhett or Tommy or the others. They just stood there, watching as Lancaster's watchdogs emerged from the vehicles, their weapons raised, black combat gear blending into the dark. Then another car pulled up. A sleek black sedan, the kind of car only powerful men ride in. The door opened, and out stepped John Everett Lancaster. The deal on the table. Lancaster smoothed his suit jacket, his gaze sweeping over them. Then he smiled. "You boys are making this complicated," he said, his voice smooth as ever. Crow didn't answer. Lancaster's eyes landed on Beckett, who was still handcuffed, still grinning like he was in on some private joke. "You have something that belongs to me," Lancaster said. Beckett chuckled. "Pretty sure I belong to no one, Johnny." Lancaster's jaw twitched, but his smile didn't fade. "You think you're winning, don't you?" Lancaster mused. Beckett's grin widened. "Not yet," he admitted, "but I will." Crow stepped forward. "This ends today," he said. Lancaster raised an eyebrow. "And how do you see that happening?" Crow inhaled. Then he pulled out the flash drive, the one with every single Revenant operation on it. The one Beckett had been hiding, the one that could ruin Lancaster forever. Crow held it up between two fingers. "Let's talk," he said, Checkmate or just another move? For the first time, Lancaster's smirk disappeared. A flicker of something sharp and dangerous crossed his face. Then it was gone. "You're bluffing," Lancaster said. Crow just smiled. "Try me." A long silence stretched between them. Then Lancaster exhaled. "All right," he said. "Let's talk." The trap springs shut. Crow nodded. "Good," he said. "But here's the thing. You don't get to make the rules anymore." Lancaster chuckled. "That so?" Crow stepped forward. "Yeah," he said, "because we're done being your pawns. You wanted Beckett? Now you're going to trade for him?" Lancaster's eyes darkened. "And what exactly do you want?" Crow didn't hesitate. "I want out," he said. "I want you out of my life. I want the Russians gone. And I want to walk away with my crew in one piece." Lancaster was silent. Then he laughed, a genuine, full-bodied chuckle. "You really think that's how this works?" Lancaster said. Crow didn't blink. "You really think I care?" Lancaster's smile faded. Then he nodded. "All right," he said. "You win." Crow's heart slammed against his ribs. That was too easy. And in that moment, he realized the trap hadn't been for Lancaster. It had been for them. Because the second Lancaster finished speaking, the first gunshot rang out. One of the vultures collapsed, blood spilling across the pavement. Then another shot, and another. It wasn't a negotiation. It was an execution. And just like that, all hell broke loose. The first gunshot cracked through the air like lightning. The second came a heartbeat later, and then hell broke loose. A double cross in blood. Crow dove for cover, his boots skidding against the gravel as more bullets tore through the night. One of the vultures, Ricky, was already down, his body twitching on the asphalt, blood spreading beneath him. Rhett was dragging Tommy behind cover, returning fire with his pistol, his teeth clenched in fury. "That son of a bitch double-crossed us," Rhett shouted over the gunfire. Crow already knew. He had felt it the second Lancaster had nodded, that split second before the shooting started. The bastard had never intended to let them walk away. This wasn't a deal. This was a goddamn purge. Crow clenched his jaw, his mind racing. The watchdogs were moving fast, sweeping through the yard like professional executioners, their rifles spitting fire, their boots crushing glass and debris beneath them. And Lancaster? The bastard was still standing there, untouched, watching the carnage unfold like a man observing a chessboard. Crow locked eyes with him from across the battlefield, and in that moment he knew this wasn't just about Beckett anymore. This was about breaking them. This was personal. The vultures fight back. "On me!" Crow bellowed, yanking his sawed-off shotgun from his back and firing off 2 quick blasts. The first round took down a watchdog center mass, sending the operative sprawling. The second blew a chunk of concrete off a barricade, forcing 2 more into cover. The vultures weren't soldiers, but they had spent their lives surviving. They scattered, using the wreckage as cover, firing back in short, precise bursts. Mace, for all his betrayal, had at least left them their weapons. Rhett had a rifle. Tommy was working a sidearm, and even Beckett, still cuffed, was crouched behind a burnt-out car, using his legs to kick a discarded pistol toward Crow. "Mind letting me help?" Beckett called. Crow snatched the gun, glancing at him. "Not yet," Beckett sighed. "Worth a shot." The battlefield was a war zone now, the flash of muzzle fire illuminating the night. The air thick with the reek of burning oil and gunpowder. Crow's heart pounded. They were outnumbered, outgunned. But they weren't dead yet. Turning the tide, Crow's eyes flicked around the yard, searching for an opening. Then he saw it, a watchdog sniper perched on the roof of a half-collapsed warehouse. Lining up a shot on Rhett, Crow moved on instinct. He vaulted over a rusted-out pickup, hit the ground in a roll, and came up firing. Boom! The sniper crumpled, his body tumbling off the roof with a sickening crunch. Rhett didn't even hesitate. He turned his rifle and dropped another watchdog, his bullets tearing through the bastard's body armor like wet paper. "Keep pushing!" Crow roared. They had to move, or they were dead. Lancaster makes his move. Across the yard, Lancaster was still standing there, calm as ever, his face half lit by the burning wreckage. Then, with a slow exhale, he turned to one of his men and gave a simple nod. The watchdog immediately moved, sprinting toward one of the armored SUVs. Crow saw it too late. The SUV's back door swung open, and out came a mounted minigun. "Down!" Crow bellowed. The minigun roared to life. A storm of bullets tore through the yard, cutting down metal, glass, and anything unlucky enough to be standing in its path. A vulture, Danny, screamed as the rounds ripped into him, his body jerking before he hit the ground, unmoving. "We need to move!" Rhett bellowed. Crow's mind raced. They couldn't fight that thing head-on. They needed cover. They needed a distraction. Then he remembered the fuel drums. "Lighting the match, Rhett," Crow called, pointing toward a stack of rusted fuel barrels near the entrance. Rhett's eyes flicked to them. Then he understood. "Cover me!" he growled. Crow laid down fire, keeping the watchdogs pinned as Rhett sprinted toward the barrels. The minigun swiveled, locking onto him. Too late. Rhett skidded to a stop, raised his rifle, and fired a single shot. Boom! The explosion lit up the night, a fireball engulfing the SUV and sending the watchdogs diving for cover. The minigun went silent. For a moment, everything was still. Then Crow moved. The final push, Crow sprinted through the chaos, Beckett at his side. Rhett covering their flank. Their goal? Lancaster. Crow wasn't running anymore. He was done playing games. He was ending this. Lancaster finally reacted, his calm demeanor flickering just slightly as Crow closed the distance. He took a step back, motioning to two watchdogs to intercept. They moved, but Crow was faster. He raised his shotgun. Boom! The first watchdog collapsed, his chest blown open. The second tried to grab him. Crow flipped the shotgun, gripping the barrel, and swung it like a bat. The watchdog's jaw cracked, his body hitting the dirt. And then Crow was standing face to face with Lancaster. A standoff at the end of the world. Lancaster didn't reach for a gun, didn't run, didn't flinch. He just smiled. "You should have taken my offer," Lancaster said. Crow's fingers twitched on the trigger. "We're done," he said, but before he could pull the trigger, Lancaster spoke again. "You kill me," he said, "and the world will burn." Crow hesitated. Lancaster's eyes gleamed. "You don't know what you've just started, boy," he said softly, "but you will." And then a sudden sharp pain bloomed in Crow's side. His body locked up, and he realized he had been shot from behind. The real betrayal. Crow's vision blurred, the pain exploding through his ribs. He turned, staggering, just in time to see Mace standing there, holding a smoking pistol. His eyes were dark, empty. "I told you," Mace murmured. "You picked the wrong side." Crow's legs buckled. His gun slipped from his fingers. The last thing he saw before he hit the ground? Lancaster, smiling, like he had won. And maybe he had. Crow hit the ground hard, the impact sending a fresh jolt of agony through his ribs. The gunshot wound burned, hot and deep, as blood spread across his shirt, soaking into the dirt beneath him. Above him, the night swirled, the sounds of battle fading into a dull, muted roar. He could hear Rhett shouting his name, could see Tommy crawling toward him, his face pale, his shoulder still bleeding. But the only thing Crow could focus on was Mace, standing over him, a smoking pistol in his hand, his expression empty. "You shouldn't have fought it," Mace muttered, shaking his head. "You should have just given him up." Crow's vision blurred. He tried to move, to sit up, but his body wasn't responding. The world felt too heavy, the pain too sharp. And Lancaster was still standing there, his smile never faltering, like he had seen this coming from the very beginning. "Well," Lancaster sighed, adjusting his cuffs. "That was dramatic." He turned to Mace. "You did good." Mace nodded stiffly, his grip tightening around his gun. But there was something off in his posture, something uncertain. Lancaster stepped over to Crow, crouching beside him. "You could have made this easy," he mused. But you always had to do things the hard way, didn't you? Crow's jaw clenched. With the last ounce of strength he had left, he spat a mouthful of blood onto Lancaster's polished black boots. Lancaster chuckled. "Still got fight in you, huh?" His calm demeanor never wavered, but there was a flicker of something sharp in his eyes. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a pistol. Crow's pulse spiked. This was it. This was how it ended. Lancaster raised the gun, pressing the barrel right between Crow's eyes. "You should have stayed on my side," he murmured. Then he pulled the trigger. Click! Nothing. The gun was empty. Crow's breath hitched. Lancaster grinned. "I don't kill people like you," he said. "I make them suffer first." Then he stood. "Take him," Lancaster ordered. The watchdogs moved in. The rescue that shouldn't have happened, but before they could grab him, boom! The world erupted in flames. The explosion ripped through the yard, the shockwave sending Lancaster stumbling back as fire and debris filled the sky. Bullets whizzed overhead, and suddenly the watchdogs weren't the only ones shooting. Crow blinked through the haze, and then he saw them, bikes, roaring into the battlefield. Not the Vultures, not Russians, someone else. Then he heard a voice crackle through the chaos. "Hope you assholes didn't start the party without us." Crow's heart lurched. It was Cole and the rest of the Vultures. They had come back, turning the tables. The battlefield exploded into pure chaos as the reinforcements slammed into the fight, bullets flying, engines roaring. Lancaster's calm broke for the first time. "Fall back," he barked. His watchdogs scrambled, trying to regroup as gunfire tore through their ranks. Mace hesitated, his gun still in his hand, his eyes darting between Lancaster and Crow. Then Rhett tackled him. They hit the ground, rolling through the dirt, fists flying. Crow, still bleeding, forced himself to move. He reached for his shotgun. His fingers brushed against the handle, and then someone grabbed him. Not a watchdog, not a vulture. Beckett. The former spook hauled him to his feet, slinging Crow's arm over his shoulder. "Come on," Beckett grunted. "No dying yet." Crow stumbled, his vision still swimming. "You planned this," he muttered. Beckett smirked. "Not all of it." They staggered toward the bikes, the battle still raging around them. Lancaster had vanished into the smoke, his men falling back toward their SUVs. Rhett, still pinning Mace to the ground, pressed a pistol against his former brother's head. "This is for Crow, you son of a bitch," Rhett growled. Mace didn't beg, didn't plead. He just closed his eyes, and then a single gunshot rang out. The cost of betrayal. Crow didn't look back. He didn't need to. Mace was gone. And maybe he had been gone long before tonight. Cole roared up beside them, his bike screeching to a halt. "Need a ride?" he shouted. Crow barely nodded before he was thrown onto the back of the bike, Beckett climbing up behind him. The rest of the Vultures fell in line, and then they were riding out of hell. A final goodbye. The flames grew smaller behind them, fading into the distance as the battlefield disappeared into the night. Crow's head slumped forward, his strength nearly gone. Beckett held onto him, keeping him from falling off the bike. "You still breathing?" Beckett asked. Crow let out a weak chuckle. "Barely," Beckett nodded. "Good," he muttered, "because this ain't over." Crow exhaled. It never was. It never would be. Not until Lancaster was dead. Not until the Black Vultures were free. Not until the game ended for good. And as the highway stretched before them, Crow made a silent promise. One day, John Everett Lancaster would die, and Crow would be the one to put him in the ground. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, a black ribbon slicing through the desert night, flanked by nothing but sand and silence. The Black Vultures rode hard, engines screaming, their bikes roaring against the wind. Behind them, wreckage, blood, bodies, and a war they could no longer outrun. The price of betrayal. Crow slumped against Cole, his body weak, the gunshot wound burning like a fire under his ribs. But it wasn't the pain that weighed on him. It was Mace, his brother, his traitor. Crow had seen plenty of men die, but this one felt different. Mace had been family once, had been someone Crow trusted with his life, and now he was just another ghost left behind on the battlefield. Crow exhaled, trying to push the thought away. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. A moment of refuge. They didn't stop until they reached the safe house, a broken-down motel on the edge of a town that barely existed. No signs, no traffic, just an old neon vacancy sign flickering weakly against the dark. They pulled into the lot, their bikes rolling to a stop, the engines cutting off one by one. For a moment, nobody moved, nobody spoke. Then, "Get him inside," Rhett muttered, nodding toward Crow. Cole and Beckett hauled him off the bike, supporting his weight as they half-carried, half-dragged him into one of the motel rooms. Crow groaned as they set him down on the bed, the pain lancing through him like a knife. "Shit!" Tommy muttered, peeling back Crow's bloody shirt. "You're lucky the bullet didn't hit anything vital." "Lucky?" Crow scoffed. "Feels like I got hit by a damn freight train. You want me to patch it up or let you bleed out?" Crow sighed. "Patch it up." Tommy grabbed a bottle of vodka from his pack, twisting the cap off with his teeth. "This is gonna hurt," he warned. Crow just gritted his teeth, and then the burn hit. White hot, like fire under his skin. Crow let out a sharp hiss, his fingers digging into the mattress. Tommy worked fast, stitching the wound with the steady hands of a man who had done this too many times before. When it was finally over, Crow let out a shaky breath, his body coated in sweat. "Done," Tommy muttered, tying off the final stitch. Crow didn't answer. His mind was elsewhere. The flash drive that could burn the world Beckett was leaning against the dresser, twirling the flash drive between his fingers. The same flash drive that had nearly gotten them all killed, the same flash drive that contained every single secret of Revenant. "You really should have let me die back there," Beckett mused. Crow glanced up, his breath still uneven. "You saying you want to go back?" Beckett smirked. "Not particularly," he admitted. "But now you're in this, and you don't even realize how deep yet." Crow forced himself to sit up, ignoring the sharp pull in his ribs. "Then tell me," he said, "what's on that drive that's worth killing this many people over?" Beckett's grin faded. He turned the flash drive over in his hands, his gaze distant. Then he spoke. "It's not just names," Beckett said. "It's operations, countries that were overthrown, wars that were never supposed to happen, elections that were rigged before the first vote was ever cast." Crow felt his stomach tighten. Beckett exhaled. "You ever wonder why Lancaster disappeared after his presidency?" he asked. Crow narrowed his eyes. "Everyone said he wanted a quiet retirement," he muttered. Beckett chuckled. "Yeah? Well, that was bullshit. The truth?" He leaned in slightly. "Lancaster didn't disappear. He was buried." Silence filled the room. Beckett continued. "The government realized he was too dangerous to keep in play," he said. "They stripped him of everything, cut him off from his contacts, his power, his influence. They wanted him gone." Crow's jaw tightened. "And yet," Beckett continued, "he's still here, still playing the game. You ever wonder why?" Crow swallowed. "Because they didn't bury him deep enough." Beckett nodded. "And now," he murmured, "he wants revenge. The cost of knowing the truth." Crow's head spun. If this was true, if Lancaster was really still running his own shadow war, pulling strings from the dark, then they weren't just up against the Russians, they weren't just up against a former president, they were up against the entire system. "This doesn't end well for you," Beckett said, watching him closely. Crow met his gaze. "You mean for us," he corrected. Beckett smirked. "Sure," he said. "Us. A war that would never end." Outside, the desert wind howled, rattling the motel windows. Rhett sat by the door, loading magazines, his face grim. Tommy was cleaning his gun, his hands still stained with Crow's blood. The rest of the crew, they were silent, waiting, thinking, planning, because now there was no going back. Crow inhaled, his ribs protesting the movement. Then he turned back to Beckett. "What's our next move?" Beckett grinned. "You really want to know?" Crow nodded. Beckett exhaled. "All right," he said. "Then listen close, because this is where things get ugly." The warning that came too late before Beckett could say another word. The power cut out. The room plunged into darkness. Everyone froze. Crow's heart pounded in his chest. "Tell me that's not what I think it is," Rhett muttered. Beckett smirked. "Oh, it's exactly what you think it is." And then the first bullet shattered the motel window. The final chase begins. Chaos erupted. More bullets ripped through the walls, dust and debris filling the air. The vultures hit the floor, returning fire as figures moved outside the motel, silhouettes barely visible in the moonlight. "How the hell did they find us?" Tommy roared. Crow's mind raced. Then it clicked. Mace. The bastard had led them right to Lancaster. Crow gritted his teeth. "Doesn't matter," he shouted. "We gotta go!" He grabbed Beckett by the arm, yanking him toward the door. The bullets kept coming, shattering wood and glass, slicing through the paper-thin motel walls. Crow didn't care, didn't stop, didn't look back. Because now, the war wasn't waiting anymore. It had found them. And it was coming full force. The night was alive with gunfire, the motel walls splintering apart as bullets ripped through them like paper. Crow shoved Beckett forward, half dragging, half carrying him toward the back exit as rounds tore into the furniture, the walls, the mirrors, anything in their way. The vultures were already moving, firing back through the windows, laying down cover fire while the enemy advanced. "Who the hell is shooting at us?" Tommy bellowed, pressing himself behind an overturned table as glass rained down. Rhett peeked out, eyes narrowing at the dark figures outside. "They ain't Russians," Rhett shouted. "These guys are military." Crow's stomach twisted. Lancaster, the bastard, had sent professionals, and he wasn't taking prisoners. No more running. The vultures had spent their whole lives running, from the law, from rivals, from every damn problem that came knocking. But tonight, there was nowhere left to run. Crow clenched his jaw. They had two choices: fight their way out, or die in this rat trap of a motel. And Crow wasn't dying tonight. The escape plan. "The bikes," Crow said, gritting through the pain in his ribs. "We get to the bikes. We get the hell out of here." Beckett laughed bitterly. "Yeah, great plan," he said, gesturing to the storm of gunfire outside. "You planning on growing wings too?" Crow ignored him. He turned to Rhett. "We need a distraction." Rhett nodded once. Then he grabbed 2 grenades from his vest. "Cover your ears," he muttered. Then he threw them, lighting up the night. The first grenade exploded near the gas pumps. A chain reaction ignited, sending a fireball roaring into the sky, the flames licking across the parking lot. The second grenade hit a squad of advancing soldiers, forcing them to dive for cover as the blast sent shrapnel and debris in every direction. For 2 seconds, the shooting stopped. For 2 seconds, the night held its breath. And that was all the time the vultures needed. Breaking free. "Go, go, go!" Crow roared. The vultures bolted, moving fast and low, sprinting through the chaos as the flames roared behind them. The enemy regrouped fast, firing into the smoke, but they were too late. The vultures had reached the bikes. Crow slammed onto his Harley, Beckett jumping onto the back behind him. "Drive like hell!" Beckett shouted. Crow revved the engine, the machine screaming to life. Then they were gone. The ride through fire. The desert stretched endless and open, the moon casting long shadows across the dunes. The vultures rode hard, their engines roaring in the silence, the heat of the explosion still burning behind them. But Crow knew they weren't safe yet. Behind them, the armored trucks were already in pursuit, kicking up dust as their headlights pierced the night. And above, a goddamn helicopter. "Son of a bitch," Rhett snarled. "They're still coming." Crow's heart slammed against his ribs. They needed a way out, fast. A desperate gamble. Up ahead, the desert road split. One path led toward town, where the highways were open and dangerous. The other, the mountain roads, winding, narrow, deadly at these speeds. Crow made his choice. "Take the mountain pass." Rhett hesitated. "Crow, that's suicide." Crow didn't blink. "Better than getting shot in the back." And just like that, he turned his bike toward the cliffs. The others followed. No hesitation, no second guessing. Because when you ride with the vultures, you ride until the end. The death ride. The bikes hit the incline fast, the tires kicking up dust and gravel as the road narrowed. Behind them, the trucks followed, struggling to keep pace. The helicopter hovered overhead, its spotlight scanning for a kill shot. Then the gunfire started again. "Floor it!" Crow bellowed. The bike screamed around the tight bends, the cliffside a sheer drop on one side, the mountain wall pressing against them on the other. And then a sudden burst of bullets ripped through the group. Cole let out a sharp cry, his bike jerking sideways as a round caught his leg. Crow reached for him, but it was too late. Cole's bike slid off the road. The machine flipped. Cole was gone. Just like that, 1 second here, the next, lost to the darkness. Crow gritted his teeth, the rage boiling inside him. There was no time to grieve, no time to stop, because they were still being hunted. And there was only one way to stop this: Beckett's insane idea. "All right," Beckett shouted over the wind. "I got an idea." Crow didn't look at him. "That's great," Crow snapped. "Unless it involves a missile launcher, I don't want to hear it." Beckett grinned. "You don't need a missile," he said. "You just need gravity." Crow blinked. Then he got it. His gaze flicked to the ridge above them, the sheer cliff face that hung over the narrow road. If they could trigger a rock slide. Crow's grip tightened on the throttle. "You sure about this?" Beckett smirked. "Not even a little." Bringing down the mountain, Rhett, still holding his rifle, caught on immediately. "Tell me where to hit," he called. Beckett pointed. "There, higher up." Rhett gritted his teeth, took aim, and fired. The first shot hit the rock face, sending small stones tumbling down. The second shot cracked the weakened ledge, and the third, the mountain caved. The collapse. A wall of rock and debris came crashing down, swallowing the road behind them. The first armored truck slammed into the collapse, its wheels locked up, its front end crumpling into the stone. The second truck barely stopped in time, its driver slamming on the brakes before it met the same fate. The helicopter swerved, unable to track through the rising dust cloud. And just like that, the vultures were gone. Survivors in the dark. The vultures pulled off the road, their engines rumbling in the silence. They were alive, but not all of them. Crow looked back toward the mountain pass, toward where Cole had been. The rage burned hot in his chest. Lancaster had taken everything from them, and Crow was done running. He turned to Beckett. "You still got that flash drive?" Beckett nodded slowly. Crow exhaled. "Good," he said, "because we're about to burn Lancaster to the ground." Beckett grinned. "Now we're talking." The war wasn't over. It was just getting started. The desert stretched out ahead of them, vast, endless, and silent. The Black Vultures rode hard, their bikes slicing through the moonlit highway, the wind howling past them like ghosts whispering in the dark. Behind them, the mountain pass was buried. The armored trucks were crushed. The helicopter was blind. For the first time in hours, they weren't being hunted. But Crow knew better. This wasn't over, not even close. A war they couldn't outrun. Rhett pulled up beside him, his face grim, jaw tight. "We need a plan," he called over the wind. Crow barely nodded. "Yeah," he muttered. "We do." Because Lancaster wasn't the type to let a failed ambush slide. He'd be regrouping, sending more men. And the Russians? They weren't gone either. The flash drive Beckett carried was still worth killing over. And Crow had no doubt that everyone who had survived tonight would be gunning for it. The only question was, where the hell did they go now? The safe house that wasn't safe. An hour later, they pulled into a run-down truck stop, the flickering neon sign barely lighting up the cracked pavement. The place had seen better days. Graffiti covered the walls. The old diner next door had its windows boarded up, and the gas pumps looked like they hadn't worked since the Bush administration. But for now, it would have to do. The vultures parked their bikes, killed their engines, and staggered inside the dimly lit convenience store. Beckett moved toward the back. grabbing a bottle of whiskey off the shelf like he was shopping for groceries. Crow collapsed into a booth, exhaling sharply as pain rippled through his ribs. Tommy slid in next to him, his own shoulder still wrapped in a blood-stained rag. "We can't keep doing this," Tommy muttered. Crow didn't argue, because he was right. They were bleeding, exhausted, running out of places to hide. And Lancaster, he would never stop. They needed help, but the problem was, they didn't have any. A message from nowhere. The burner phone in Crow's pocket buzzed. He frowned, pulling it out. Nobody had this number. Nobody alive anyway. He flipped it open, expecting another death threat. Instead, there was one message. "Unknown number. I hear you're looking for a way out." Crow's pulse kicked up. Rhett leaned in, glancing at the screen. "The hell is that?" Crow's fingers hovered over the keys. His gut told him this was a trap. But what choice did they have? He typed out a response. "Crow, who is this?" A pause, then, "Unknown number. A friend. A dangerous proposition." Crow's jaw tightened. They didn't have friends. Not anymore. But before he could reply, the phone buzzed again. "Unknown number. Meet me in 2 hours. I'll send the location. No tricks, no games. You want to win? This is how you do it." Beckett leaned over, glancing at the screen. "Sounds legit," he said dryly. "Definitely not a setup." Crow exhaled. "Yeah, well," he muttered, "we don't have a lot of options." Beckett grinned. "That's the spirit." The meeting in the dark. 2 hours later, they were back on the road heading toward a location sent by the mystery number. The destination, a private airstrip just outside a small town. Not exactly reassuring. "Jesus," Tommy muttered as they pulled up, scanning the empty tarmac. "If this ain't a setup, I don't know what is." Crow didn't disagree, but they didn't have a choice. They climbed off their bikes, weapons at the ready, and then a black SUV rolled onto the runway, its tires crunching against the pavement. The doors opened, and a man stepped out. Crow's stomach dropped because he recognized him. And if this guy was involved, then things were worse than he thought. The man in the suit. The man was tall, sharp-featured, with graying hair and a scar down his left cheek. He was wearing a suit that cost more than all of their bikes combined. And his name? Gabriel Stone. Former CIA? Now? Nobody knew. And that was what made him dangerous. Stone smiled slightly as he stepped forward, his eyes flicking over the vultures like he was measuring their worth. "Been a long time, Crow," he said. Crow clenched his jaw. "Not long enough. A devil's bargain. Gabriel Stone wasn't the kind of man you crossed, but he also wasn't the kind of man who helped people out of the kindness of his heart. If he was here, it meant he wanted something." Stone glanced at Beckett, then at the flash drive still tucked into his pocket. "So," he mused, "this is what all the fuss is about." Beckett smirked. "Jealous?" Stone didn't smile. "You have no idea how many people want that drive," he said. Beckett tilted his head. "That why you're here?" Stone exhaled. "No," he admitted. "I'm here because Lancaster is making moves I don't like." Crow narrowed his eyes. "You're saying you want to help us?" Stone chuckled. "Let's get something straight," he said. "I'm not here to play hero, but Lancaster, he's out of control, and that means he's bad for business." Crow's fingers twitched. "What's your price?" Stone studied him. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a folder. He tossed it onto the hood of the nearest bike. Crow grabbed it, flipping it open. And what he saw made his blood run cold. A kill list with his name on it. Inside the folder were surveillance photos. Pictures of Crow, Rhett, Tommy, even Cole before he died. And at the bottom, a list of names. The title at the top read, Operation Clean Slate, and at the very top of the list, Jackson Crow, Miller. Crow's fingers tightened on the paper. "This is real?" he asked. Stone nodded. "It's already in motion," he said. "Lancaster's done playing games. He's wiping the board clean. You, your crew," he motioned to the others. "You're all on the list. Within a week, you'll be dead." Silence. Then Rhett stepped forward. "And you want us to what?" he asked. Stone exhaled. "Finish this," he said, "before Lancaster finishes you." The road ahead. Crow's mind spun. They were already running for their lives. But now they knew exactly how much time they had left, and the only way to stop it: kill the man who started it. Crow looked at Stone. "You want him dead?" he asked. Stone smiled slightly. "I don't care how it happens," he said. "I just want him gone." Crow exhaled. "Good," he muttered, "because so do I." And just like that, the Black Vultures had their final job. And this time, they weren't riding to survive. They were riding to end this war, once and for all. The desert stretched wide and empty, the road ahead glowing under the moonlight, a silent reminder that there was no turning back. The Black Vultures rode in formation, their bikes roaring through the open night, engines like distant thunder rolling across the sands. Behind them, the wreckage of everything they once knew. Ahead, the final job. And Crow knew not all of them were coming back. A pact with the devil, Gabriel Stone's words, still echoed in Crow's head as they rode. "Finish this before Lancaster finishes you." The man had handed them everything, a dossier full of deadly truths, evidence that Lancaster wasn't just coming for them. He was coming for everyone. The mission was simple: kill Lancaster. Burn him down before he erased them from existence. And yet, something felt wrong. A plan that couldn't fail, but would. The meeting place was a private airstrip, hidden deep in the desert, far from prying eyes. Stone had set it up, said it was the only way to lure Lancaster in. "He won't see it coming," Stone had said. "Not from you." Crow had nodded, but deep down, he wasn't so sure. Lancaster was too smart, too careful. He never walked into traps, and Crow knew if this went sideways, there'd be no second chances. The final ride. They reached the airstrip just before dawn, the sky painted in dark blues and burning oranges. The hangar loomed ahead, a massive metal shell sitting in the middle of nowhere. Stone was already there, waiting beside a black SUV, his hands in his pockets, his face unreadable. Crow pulled his bike to a stop, the others skidding in beside him. Beckett climbed off, stretching his arms like he hadn't just been dragged into a war. "You really think he's showing up?" Beckett mused. Stone didn't blink. "He'll come," he said. Crow gritted his teeth. "Yeah," he muttered. "And what if he doesn't?" Stone turned to him. "Then you're already dead. The trap is sprung." The wait felt endless. Every second stretched longer than the last. The vultures stood tense, weapons ready, eyes scanning the desert for the first sign of trouble. Then a low rumble, engines. A convoy of black SUVs kicking up dust, approaching fast. Crow's pulse spiked. "Here we go." The SUVs pulled up, their doors opening in unison, and out stepped John Everett Lancaster. Flanked by his watchdogs, the bastard was dressed clean, his tailored suit barely touched by the desert wind. He looked around the airstrip, then let out a small chuckle. "You always were predictable, Crow," Lancaster mused. Crow didn't move, didn't blink, just kept his gun steady. "You came alone?" Crow asked. Lancaster smiled. "Of course not." And that's when Crow saw them. Behind the convoy, hidden in the ridgeline, were snipers. A lot of them. Crow's chest tightened. It was a setup. The last betrayal before Crow could react. A single gunshot rang out. Not from the watchdogs, not from the snipers, from Gabriel Stone. And the bullet, it slammed into Rhett's chest. Rhett staggered, his eyes wide, blood blooming across his vest. Crow's heart stopped. Then everything exploded. A firefight in hell. The watchdogs opened fire, bullets shredding the airstrip, ricocheting off the hangar walls. Crow dove for cover, his ears ringing as gunfire erupted from every direction. Stone had sold them out. He had played them from the start. Crow's rage boiled over. "You son of a bitch!" he roared, unloading his shotgun toward the SUV, blasting out the windows in a spray of glass. But Stone was already gone, moving with trained precision, ducking behind a row of crates. Beckett grabbed Crow's arm, yanking him down just as a sniper round blasted through the air where Crow's head had been. "Less yelling," Beckett grunted. "More shooting." Crow gritted his teeth. Rhett was down, the vultures were pinned, and Lancaster was still standing. The end of the road. The battle raged on, bodies dropping on both sides, the airstrip lit up with fire and death. Crow fought like a cornered animal, his shotgun roaring, his hands slick with blood, but it wasn't enough. They were losing. One by one, the vultures were falling. Tommy took a shot to the leg, collapsing behind a crate. Cole was dragging him, trying to keep him moving, but there were too many of them, too many guns, too many bullets. And then Crow's luck ran out. A round ripped through his side, knocking him back against the hangar wall. Pain exploded through him, his vision blurred, and through the haze he saw Lancaster approaching, gun in hand, a smirk on his lips. The final words Crow couldn't move, could barely breathe. He had fought, had tried, had done everything to escape this fate, but Lancaster had won. Again. The former president crouched beside him, his eyes cold, his voice barely above a whisper. "You should have taken the deal," Lancaster murmured. Crow's fingers twitched toward his gun, but Lancaster kicked it away. Then he pressed his pistol against Crow's forehead. "This is how men like you end," he said. Crow stared up at him, refusing to look away. If this was how he went out, he'd do it standing, even if he was on the ground. Lancaster exhaled. "Goodbye, Crow." His finger tightened on the trigger, and then a single gunshot rang out. But it wasn't Lancaster's, the twist that changed everything. Lancaster's body jerked, blood bursting from his chest. His eyes widened, and then he collapsed. Crow blinked through the pain, barely able to see who had taken the shot. But then a shadow loomed over him. Beckett, holding a pistol, its barrel still smoking. He crouched beside Crow, tilting his head. "Looks like I saved your ass again," Beckett mused. Crow let out a weak laugh. "Didn't think you had it in you." Beckett grinned. "Neither did I." The aftermath of a war. The battle was over. Lancaster was dead. His watchdogs, scattered. The snipers, gone. Gabriel Stone, nowhere to be found. And the Black Vultures, what was left of them? They had survived, barely. Beckett helped Crow to his feet, his grip firm. "So," Beckett mused, "what now?" Crow exhaled, looking at the burning airstrip, at the bodies of men who had chased him for so long. "Now," he muttered, "we ride." And with that, the Black Vultures disappeared into the night, leaving nothing behind but ashes and ghosts. The Black Vultures rode through the night, engines growling low like animals nursing their wounds. The desert stretched wide and empty, the sky streaked with the last embers of dying fire, the scent of blood and burning fuel still clinging to the wind. John Everett Lancaster was dead, but the war wasn't over, not yet. Survivors, but barely. Crow felt the pain in his ribs with every bump in the road, the gunshot wound still fresh, bleeding through his jacket. Rhett was barely conscious behind him, his own wound turning his vest a deep shade of crimson. Tommy rode one-handed, the other clutching his thigh, blood dripping onto his foot. Cole? Cole was gone. The loss burned. The Black Vultures had never been good men, but they were brothers. And now they were just a few ghosts left riding. Beckett's secret smile. Beckett rode behind Crow, somehow looking the least broken of them all. No blood, no bruises. Just that same smirk, like he knew something they didn't. "You enjoying the view back there?" Crow muttered, his voice raw. Beckett chuckled. "More than you think," he said. "You don't realize it yet. Do you?" Crow's fingers tightened on the handlebars. "Realize what?" Beckett leaned forward slightly, his voice low and calm. "You just killed the most dangerous man in America," he murmured. "And now everyone's going to want to know who did it." Crow's chest tightened. He already knew what Beckett meant. Lancaster had too many enemies, but he also had too many friends. And the moment word got out that he was dead, the whole goddamn world was going to come looking for answers. And for them. No place left to hide. 2 hours later, they pulled into an old roadside garage, the neon sign flickering weakly against the dark. They killed their engines, the silence heavy as they staggered off their bikes. The air smelled of oil, rust, and sweat. Inside, the garage was empty, long abandoned, the old tools still sitting exactly where someone had left them years ago. Tommy collapsed onto a workbench, exhaling sharply. "Shit," he muttered. "I think I lost enough blood to fill a damn swimming pool." Rhett slid to the ground beside him, his face pale, but his eyes still sharp. Crow leaned against the doorway, his legs barely holding him up. But Beckett was calm as ever. "The problem with killing a ghost. You're awfully quiet," Rhett muttered. Glancing at Beckett shrugged. "Just thinking," he said. "Wondering how long you boys plan to keep running before you realize the truth." Crow narrowed his eyes. "And what truth is that?" Beckett smiled. "You didn't kill a man," he said. "You killed a ghost." Crow's jaw tightened. Beckett continued. "Guys like Lancaster," he said, "they don't just die. They leave legacies, secrets, files that people would kill to keep buried. And now that he's gone..." He tilted his head. "Well," he mused, "someone's got to clean up the mess." The next target, Crow already knew what was coming. He had felt it the second he pulled the trigger. Lancaster wasn't just a man. He was a system. And now, that system was going to war. Crow ran a hand over his face, exhaustion dragging at him. "So," he muttered, "who comes after us first?" Beckett grinned. "Take your pick," he said. "Langley, the Pentagon, maybe the Russians finally get their act together? Hell, there's probably a dozen warlords across the world wondering why their private banker isn't answering his phone." Crow exhaled. "Great," he muttered. "So we just painted a target on our backs the size of Texas." Beckett chuckled. "Yeah," he said. "But hey, at least now you know what it feels like to be me." The offer that shouldn't have been made. Beckett stood, stretching his arms, watching Crow carefully. "Look," he said, "you want my advice?" Crow didn't answer. Beckett took that as a yes. "You got two options," he said. "Option one, you keep running. Hide in whatever hole you can find until someone bigger and meaner digs you out." Crow stayed silent. "And option two," Beckett continued, "you stop running, you fight back, and you burn the whole damn thing down." Silence. Heavy. Dangerous. Then, "You're saying we go after the people who ran Lancaster?" Rhett muttered. Beckett nodded. "That's exactly what I'm saying." Crow let out a short, bitter laugh. "You don't know us very well," he said. "We're not freedom fighters." Beckett tilted his head. "Could have fooled me," he said. Crow's fingers twitched. It was insane, stupid, suicidal, and yet, for the first time in a long time, it didn't sound like running. A ghost from the past. The burner phone buzzed again. Crow frowned, pulling it out. Another unknown number. One message. "Unknown number. You want to win? I know where to start. Be in New Orleans in 24 hours. I'll find you." Crow stared at the screen. His stomach twisted. "Who the hell is that?" Tommy muttered. Crow didn't answer, because he already had a feeling. Whoever it was, they weren't done with this war, and neither was he. The last ride before war. The sky was getting lighter, dawn creeping up over the horizon. The Black Vultures stood in silence, watching the first traces of daylight paint the desert in muted gold. They were alive, they had won. But the road ahead? It was going to be long, bloody and violent. Crow took one last look at the message on his phone. Then he slid it back into his pocket. "We ride at dawn," he muttered. The others nodded. No questions, no hesitation, because this wasn't about survival anymore. This was about finishing what they started. The Black Vultures mounted their bikes, engines rumbling low. Then, one by one, they rode out into the sunrise. And the war followed them. The Black Vultures rode into the rising sun, engines thundering through the quiet desert morning. Their tires kicked up dust, their bodies aching from battle, but none of them looked back, because behind them was nothing but fire, blood, and ghosts, and ahead, war. a road without an exit. Crow felt the weight of it pressing down on him, the aftermath of everything they had done. John Everett Lancaster was dead. The Russians wanted their revenge. The CIA wanted their secrets back. And whoever had sent that mysterious message from New Orleans. They were waiting, watching. Crow gritted his teeth, his ribs still aching, but the pain was nothing compared to the thought that refused to leave his mind. They had killed the most powerful man in America, and yet nothing had changed. Because Lancaster wasn't just a man, he was a system, and that system was still standing, the weight of the dead. They rode hard for 2 hours, stopping only when they reached an abandoned way station on the side of the highway. The place was a wreck, its windows shattered, the old fuel pumps covered in graffiti, perfect for laying low. As the Vultures rolled to a stop, Crow slid off his bike, his legs barely holding him up. Rhett staggered over, his face still pale from blood loss, but his eyes steady. "How much longer we play in this game?" Rhett muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. Crow exhaled. "Until it's over," he said. Rhett chuckled, shaking his head. "It's never over," he muttered. "You know that," Crow did, but he also knew one more thing. If they didn't finish it now, the war would follow them forever. A message from the shadows. The burner phone buzzed again. Crow pulled it out, the message flashing across the cracked screen. "Unknown number. You're late." Crow's jaw tightened. He typed back. "Crow, we're on the road. Where's the meet?" A pause. Then, "Unknown number. Dockside Warehouse, New Orleans. Midnight." Crow stared at the message. Tommy glanced over, still favoring his injured leg. "Sounds like a trap," he muttered. Crow nodded. "Probably is," Tommy sighed. "But we're still going." Crow looked at the others. They were dirty, bruised and bleeding, but none of them spoke up, because they all knew the truth. This wasn't about survival anymore. This was about finishing what they started. Crow slid the phone back into his pocket. "Yeah," he muttered, "we're still going." New Orleans, a city built on lies. 12 hours later, the Black Vultures rolled into New Orleans. The city was alive, neon lights flickering, the streets buzzing with life even as the sun dipped below the skyline. But beneath the tourists, the music, the street performers, Crow could feel it. The tension. They weren't safe here. The second they had crossed into this city, someone had known, the eyes watching them from alleyways, the unmarked cars that seemed to slow down when they passed. New Orleans was a city built on secrets and lies, and tonight they were walking straight into both. The warehouse meeting midnight came fast. The warehouse sat on the edge of the docks, looming over the water like a rusted-out skeleton, its steel doors covered in faded warnings. The Vultures rolled up slow, engines humming as they stopped just outside. Crow climbed off his bike, motioning for the others to fan out, covering the exits. Beckett leaned against his own bike, arms crossed, smirking. "This is the part where we all die, right?" he mused. Crow didn't answer. Instead, he walked straight up to the warehouse doors and pushed them open. A face from the past. The inside of the warehouse was dark, lit only by a few hanging bulbs, their light casting long shadows across the crates stacked along the walls, and standing in the center, a man Crow hadn't seen in 10 years. He wore a sharp suit, his hair slicked back, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. He was older now, but Crow would have known him anywhere. "Son of a bitch," Rhett muttered. Crow exhaled sharply. "Hello, Vincent, a brother-in-blood Vincent Rossi, former Vulture, one-time brother, now a ghost from the past." Vincent smiled, stepping forward. "Crow," he said smoothly, "you look like hell." Crow didn't blink. "You sent the message?" Vincent nodded. "I did." Crow clenched his fists. "Why?" Vincent exhaled, his eyes darkening. "Because you just pissed off the wrong people," he said, "and you don't even know how deep this goes." Crow didn't flinch. "I know enough," he said. Vincent chuckled. "No," he said, "you don't." Then he pulled a folder from his jacket and tossed it onto the table between them. Crow opened it. Inside, more names, more faces, more people who wanted them dead, and at the bottom of the list, one name stood out, Gabriel Stone. Crow's stomach twisted. Vincent smiled. "Yeah," he said. "Turns out Lancaster wasn't the only one pulling strings. The real puppet master Crow stared at the name, the weight of it sinking in. Stone had set them up, had played both sides, had used them to take out Lancaster because he had always been the bigger threat. And now, Stone was the last man standing. Vincent leaned in. "You want to end this," he murmured. "You want your crew to walk away? Then there's only one way out." Crow already knew the answer. "Stone dies," he said. Vincent nodded. "Stone dies." Silence settled over them. Then Beckett laughed softly from the back of the room. "Well," he mused, "this just keeps getting better." Crow closed the folder. Then he looked up at Vincent. "You in?" Crow asked. Vincent smirked. "Always." The last war begins. The Black Vultures had ridden through fire, betrayal, and blood. They had burned their past. They had killed a president. And now, they were going after the man who had set the whole thing in motion. Crow exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of it. The road ahead was suicide, but he had never been afraid of dying, only of losing. And he wasn't losing now. Not this time. Crow glanced at his crew. "Tomorrow," he said, "we go hunting." The Black Vultures nodded. No hesitation, no second-guessing, because this wasn't just revenge anymore. This was the final ride, and the road would be paved in hell. The Black Vultures rode one last time, through the streets of New Orleans, through the storm clouds of war, through the weight of everything they had done, and everything that was still left to do. This wasn't about survival anymore. This wasn't about running. This was about finishing it, and Crow knew, one way or another, this was the last ride. The target, Gabriel Stone, Vincent Rossi, had given them the final piece of the puzzle. Gabriel Stone wasn't just a puppet master. He was the man who had turned the Black Vultures into pawns. He had played Lancaster. He had played the Russians. And now, he was waiting for them. Not in a bunker, not behind armored walls, but at the top of a skyscraper in downtown New Orleans. Because Stone wasn't hiding. He was daring them to come. The plan that shouldn't work. "You really think we can pull this off?" Rhett muttered, checking his rifle as they stopped outside an old warehouse near the river. Crow exhaled. "No," he admitted, "but we don't have a choice." They had a handful of guns, a few grenades, and a whole lot of bad intentions. That was it. But the truth was simple. If they didn't take out Stone, he would come for them. And next time, they wouldn't see it coming. The elevator to hell. The Black Vultures moved fast, slipping into the office building next to the skyscraper, using a service elevator to reach the rooftop from there. A zip line across the gap. Insane, yeah. But they were past the point of caring. One by one, they slid across, landing on the penthouse balcony of Stone's tower. And waiting inside was hell itself. The last stand. The first gunshot shattered the glass, sending shards flying as Stone's private security opened fire. The Black Vultures didn't hesitate. Rhett dropped the first two guards, his rifle barking in the tight space. Tommy tossed a grenade, blowing open a side hallway. "Beckett?" Beckett grabbed a pistol off a dead guard, smirking. "Well," he muttered, "this is fun." Crow moved like a ghost, weaving between bullets, his shotgun kicking like a beast in his hands. They weren't here to fight. They were here to kill one man. Stone's last game. They found him in the penthouse office, standing behind a wall of bulletproof glass, watching them with cold amusement. "You boys really are persistent," Stone mused, sipping a glass of whiskey. Crow's breathing was ragged, his body aching, bleeding, burning, but he didn't care. "You used us," Crow growled. Stone smiled. "Yes," he said, "and look how far you've come." Crow's fingers twitched on the trigger. But before he could fire, the room exploded into motion. The death of Gabriel Stone's personal guards flooded the room, automatic rifles tearing through furniture, glass, and walls. The Black Vultures fought like demons, moving fast, burning through ammo, every second bringing them closer to death. Rhett took a bullet to the side, grunting but still firing back. Tommy went down, his leg giving out, but he still crawled for his gun. And Beckett just laughed, shooting a guard in the throat before diving behind cover. Then Crow saw his opening. Stone was moving toward the back exit, reaching for a hidden panel in the wall. Crow didn't hesitate. He charged forward, tackling Stone before he could escape. The two men hit the ground hard, fists flying, teeth clashing. Stone was stronger than he looked, but Crow was fighting for everything he had left. The two men grappled, rolling over shattered glass, their weapons forgotten. Then Crow got his hands around Stone's throat, and he squeezed. A death that meant something. Stone gasped, his fingers clawing at Crow's arms, but Crow didn't let go. "You don't get to walk away from this," Crow snarled. Stone's eyes widened. For the first time, he looked afraid. He tried to speak, tried to say something, but Crow kept squeezing, and Gabriel Stone died on the floor of his own empire. The cost of freedom. The room was silent. The gunfire had stopped. The guards, dead. The Black Vultures, broken, bleeding, but standing. Crow stumbled back, breathing hard, his hands covered in blood. And for the first time since this started, he felt free. Beckett stepped forward, staring down at Stone's lifeless body. "Well," he mused, "that was satisfying." Crow didn't answer. He just turned away. They had won, but at what cost? The ride into the unknown. An hour later, they were back on their bikes. No more targets, no more plans, just the open road. Crow looked at what was left of them. Rhett, Tommy, Beckett. They had lost too many, but they were still here, still riding. And maybe that was enough. Beckett glanced at Crow as they hit the highway. "So," Beckett murmured, "what now?" Crow exhaled. The past was gone, the war was over, and the future was wide open. He twisted the throttle. The bike roared forward, and behind him, the Black Vultures followed, still riding, always riding, because no matter what, the road never ends.